Hello, and welcome to the webinar Worried About Speech: Simple Ways to Support Language in the Early Years. I'm glad you're here today. So, today we're going to be talking about how to recognize key speech and language milestones in your child under 6 years old. We're going to be talking about how to understand how communication develops. We're going to learn a few simple play-based strategies just to get you started. And we're going to know when to monitor and when to seek support. I speak with a lot of parents and educators out there, and sometimes it's hard to know when we should just monitor the child or when we should seek additional support, especially related to speech. So today I'm going to help you to build that confidence that you need in supporting children. So first off, I want to start off by saying that early communication absolutely matters. It's important to the child's learning. I know that in my 4 pillars of learning, my first pillar is language and literacy, because language is the first thing that a child needs in order to learn, right? We need to be able to communicate in order to learn any other subject area. So communication is absolutely essential to the learning process. It's essential to social connection. We can't connect with others without communication. It matters for emotional regulation. In order to be able to name my feelings, I need the words for that, right? I need to be able to communicate. And I know that behavior is communication in a lot of ways. So communication and emotional regulation are linked. And of course, literacy. Communication is important to learning to read and write and everything to do with early literacy. And I believe also that communication is linked to a person's confidence. So your ability to communicate effectively forms your confidence, right? And confidence in children if they're able to communicate and get their needs met. And it's absolutely important to remember that communication is something that is essential for all of these areas. And if there are any concerns in regards to speech and language or communication, early intervention is absolutely essential. When the brain is forming at a very fast rate, it's important to get to the supports you need to support that early brain development, and it can make a huge difference. So let's talk about the difference between speech and language. So this is something I learned in a podcast that I did a few months ago. Speech and language are actually two different things. And when you talk to speech pathologists, they will speak about speech and language in different ways. So speech in particular refers to how we say things. So that it's the how in communication, things like articulation, how we form the sounds. Do we say the word rabbit versus wabbit, right? Or missing certain pronunciations. It's about articulation, how we pronunciate. Then there's fluency, things like the rhythm and the flow of speech. And some concerns might be things like stuttering. And then there's the voice, the pitch, the tone, the volume. That all has to do with actual speech. Most of us aren't concerned as much with speech. It's more to do with language. And language refers to how we understand and use the words that we communicate, right? So it includes things like receptive language. Do we understand what's being said to us? That's the understanding part. What we're receiving, do we understand it? And then the second part of language is expressive language. And how much are we speaking, right? So, what words are we using? Can we use words, right? That's all part of expressive language, our manner of speaking. How many words can we use? So, usually, when I talk to parents and educators, the main concerns that I see are related to expressive language, right? Can children express themselves with words, and how many words do they have to be able to do that? And that all falls under what we call expressive language. But we need to understand that communication starts for children way before they even have words. Babies communicate in many ways, right? We know they communicate through crying. That is probably the first thing that they do to communicate their needs to you. When they're soiled, when they're hungry, when they're tired, when they're sick, they communicate by crying, right? That's how they get your attention. They communicate by eye contact, right? By looking at you, by you know, when you say their name, they look back at you. That's eye contact, that's communication, that's an exchange. Facial expressions, right? I love this facial expression in the photo here. They say so much with their facial expressions. I can see in the facial expression of this child, there's maybe some sense of wonder or whimsy or, maybe even happiness in that expression. So much about our facial expressions communicate our emotions and our wants and our needs as well. Gestures. In the early years, gestures are so important. Some people might mistakenly think that their children don't communicate because they don't have words. But if your child is able to gesture, to point at things they want, to move their head towards what they want, that's a gesture. That's a way of communicating their wants and needs to you. So, yes, they're still communicating even when they don't have words. And then the first verbal speech comes through babbling, right? That nonsensical ba ba ba, ma ma ma, da da da. Those are the first verbal communications we see from children, often in the infant stage. And I just love to hear children babbling. It's such a beautiful sound that they make when they're trying to, form what they think are words. And they just, rhyme off different sounds that they hear. So it's a good reminder to us that communication starts from infancy. It starts right from birth. And there's so many different ways to communicate, even before we have words. So now let's look at what are some of the milestones. So if you have a child under 6 years old, what are the things you should be looking for in terms of milestones, in terms of speech, and especially in terms of expressive language? So the first thing is by age 1, generally most children will respond to their name. So if you say their name, they will look at you, right? They will look in your direction. Now, they don't always do it 100% of the time because maybe they're just not interested in responding. But I would say about at least 80% of the time when you say their name, they look at you, they respond to their name. So they know that you're calling them and they acknowledge you. So that's our first way of communicating is that first of all, that receptive language was there. They understood that you were calling on them and you got their attention, right? The second thing you'll see is gestures, right? Children will point, or they'll nudge their heads in a certain way, or they will grab for things. Those are gestures that they can use to communicate. And many children by age 1 can even start to use sign language, which is a form of gesturing, right? We've seen children under 1 year use the more sound, right? The more symbol um, or other kinds of sign language that you can teach to them. And that's just you. Sign language, the way to teach sign language to babies is just by saying the word and using the action along with the word. And your child will very quickly pick up that this means more, right? And so when you say more and you keep doing this, they will repeat that gesture and use that gesture as well to communicate with you, even if they can't say the word more. By age 1, you'll usually hear your child also start to say their first words. Now, sometimes first words can be confused with babbling. If your child is saying ma, 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 it doesn't necessarily mean that they're saying the word mama. It's just a sound that they hear repeated and they repeat it as well. So it's not necessarily a first word. Same with da, da, da. Sometimes we think they're saying dad before they say mom. Usually that happens a lot. But a first word could be something like up, right? So if they want you to pick them up, they might say up. And that could be maybe one of their first words. Or no, right? Some children in the very beginning, the first word they learn is no, right? Because they quickly learn how to assert their independence. So, first words, you need to think about beyond the babbling, what are they saying that has meaning, right? So, are they saying something? They might be saying baba to get a bottle, right? So they're saying a first word, they're just not saying it fully correctly yet. They have, their own version of that word, but they're using the word with intention. So it's not just my babbling with no intention. The word that they're saying has intention to get their needs met. So if I said baba because I want the bottle, then that would be considered a word. But if I'm just babbling ba 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 while I'm playing, that's not necessarily a word that I'm saying. So saying first words really has to be matched with intention. It's matched with I'm saying a word to get my needs met or to get my not wants met. And you might hear those words somewhere around 1 year old. Okay, by age 2, children should have about 50 plus words. Now, that's a big leap, right? Between 1 and 2 years old, they're going to go from saying their first word to having about 50 words. And so now they can name many things in their environment. Usually things like up, you will hear. You will hear anything to do like with whatever they need, right? So milk. Usually they'll say no, right? They'll be able to maybe say mama, dada, or baby, or, like food words, right? Like banana, whatever way they say that. Whatever it is that they encounter and that they need, they're going to learn those words first. Sometimes mine. Toddlers become very possessive, so they learn that word very quickly. So usually they'll have about 50 words by age 2. And they start with single words. They start by communicating with single words, and then they will start to develop 2-word phrases. They also start to follow simple directions. So this is where you can test their hearing, right? So if you're saying something to them, if they're not responding to their name, if they're not following a simple direction from you, maybe it's something to do with hearing as well. So you should get their hearing checked. So by age 2, they're usually able to follow a simple direction like put this toy in the basket, right? They should be able to follow that. Or come sit at the table. Or come get your shoes on, right? They should be able to follow those simple directions when you give them out. So now let's look at the preschool age group, age 3 to 4. By age 3, again, the vocabulary just explodes between 2 and 3. They go from 50 words to 200 plus words, and now they start to communicate in what sounds like more of a sentence, right? So they're communicating maybe in 3-word sentences. They're starting to ask questions. And a lot of the questions start with why, right? Why this, why that? Why is the sky blue? Why do I have to put my coat on? Right? So they're starting to communicate and ask questions. Usually their language is very understandable to familiar adults. Sometimes, depending on, again, their speech, how they form the words, sometimes only their family can understand them because they have a way of speaking where maybe it's hard to understand when people aren't familiar with them. But for the parents, the siblings, it's very understandable. By age 4, we're pretty much speaking in full sentences. We're using longer sentences. We are using descriptive words like big brown dog. And we're answering questions. We're not just asking them. And we're mostly understood. Our speech is understood by everyone, right? So by age 4, we should have speech that is very complex, uses lots of vocabulary, and even able to tell stories, right? Able to recount something that's happened, tell you about what happened yesterday. So those are the general milestones. Now, up to age 5, basically here, we've pretty much developed our speech to a very high level. We're speaking clearly, we're able to hold conversation, we can follow multi-step directions, like wash your hands and then go put your coat on, right? And they're using very descriptive language at this point. So they're speaking to you and you're able to hold a real conversation with the child by age 5. It's one thing to remember when we look at milestones is that every child does develop differently. So even though I've given you age ranges here, it really is a range, right? So you shouldn't be concerned when you hit the 12-month mark and maybe you haven't hit all those milestones that I've talked about. So remember that development is a range and that within 2 to 3 months of that range, you should meet the milestone. But every child is different. Every child has a different personality. Perhaps some children are more shy. Perhaps some children are more exuberant. Personality does come into play when it comes to communication. Some children are generally more quiet. But still, even besides that, they should be able to communicate with those people who are close to them. Their environment matters, what they've been exposed to for their whole life. So I'm sure you've heard the story of the person who grew up in isolation. Their language would not be developed, right? Because their environment, they didn't hear the language spoken. So their language would not have developed at the same rate. So as long as your child has been in an environment where there's lots of rich language, you can expect normal language development. But environment definitely does matter. So it's important, when we say that we give children a very language-rich environment to help them develop language, because that's how it happens. And exposure matters, right? Children need to be exposed to language to learn language. Avoid any kind of comparisons, right? Don't look at your neighbor's child or your sister's child and compare one child with another. Really, like I said, every child is unique and every child meets their milestones at different times. What you want to look for instead is progress, right? Have they developed language skills or are they stagnant, right? Are they developing more and more skills every day? That is a good indication that your child is developing. Okay, let's look at some common myths. Now, sometimes these things get in the way of children getting the support that they need and adults seeking the support for them. So sometimes people think, oh, they'll grow out of it. Now, in the daycare environment, I've heard this one a whole lot of times. I've heard from parents, sometimes we might have a concern about a child who's not speaking by 2 years old, and they'll come to us and say, oh, I was the same when I was a child, and they'll grow out of it. I didn't speak until I was 4 years old, and I know that my child will grow out of this, right? Now, that is a myth. Children develop language according to these milestones. So if your child does not have any language by 2 years old, there's definitely a concern there, something to look into. Not to say that there's any diagnosis, but just to say, let's examine this situation. What's going on? Maybe there's an environmental concern. Maybe there's an exposure concern. Maybe there's multiple language concern. Whatever it is, there might be something that's stopping the child from developing language, right? So let's look into it. Like I said, early intervention is key. So if there is an issue, you want to catch it early. And if there's not an issue, there's no harm in seeking support. You don't lose anything. You only gain by getting support, right? So you don't lose anything by saying, oh, okay, we looked into it and there's not a problem. No harm done, right? But there could be harm done if you didn't look into it and there is a problem, right? Because you missed those early years, which are absolutely critical. Another myth I hear is that boys talk later. Not true. I've heard many verbal 12-month-old boys as well as girls. Gender has nothing to do with when you develop language. So that is an absolute complete myth. Another myth is that screen time can teach language. This one I've heard a lot recently. So a lot of parents will swear by Miss Rachel and say that Miss Rachel taught my children words. Miss Rachel taught my children lots of speech. Now, Miss Rachel is great. right? She's great at entertaining children. And yes, some children will pick up some words and some speech from her from watching screen time. However, it is not the best way for children to learn language. Children need to learn through interaction, meaning that, and this is, the pandemic taught us this, right? During the pandemic, language lagged. We saw a lot of children with speech concerns come into our daycares after the pandemic because there was two reasons actually. One is lack of interactions, right? So the child didn't have many interactions other than their immediate family. The second thing was that they couldn't see the mouth, right? So when we're wearing masks, children couldn't see our mouths move. And how children develop language, if you'll notice, is that when you're talking, they look at your mouth. They look at how the words are formed, right? They see the movement of your mouth, and that's how they learn how to speak and how to move their mouth to make the sounds. So by looking at your mouth and not being able to see it during the pandemic, they lost a lot of context in terms of how to build language skills. So we know that it's hard to see that on a screen. When you're face to face with someone, it's much easier to see how their mouth is moving rather than on a screen. So that's why screen time doesn't teach language, because you can't see the mouth move. There isn't that interaction or exchange, right? So for communication to happen, there needs to be an exchange. I speak, you speak. But for screens, it's only one directional. They're only speaking at you. There's no way for you to exchange and speak back. And that's what's critical for developing communication, is that back and forth exchange between two people. So interaction is critical. So when people say that Miss Rachel teaches language, it's absolutely false. Screen time can never teach language. Interaction is how language develops. So now let's look at what are some red flags. What are some things you need to think about or consider to determine, you know what, maybe I'm just going to monitor, or maybe I really do need to seek support. And we'll talk about how you could seek support in a little bit, but here's some things to look at. So these are things that we generally in daycare look at in children, because we see many children, we get to see the differences in children really quickly. So the first thing you would notice is limited eye contact, meaning that the child has difficulty maintaining eye contact with you. They may look up at you for a second, but then quickly dart their eyes away because they can't maintain eye contact with you. Most children by 1 year old should be able to maintain eye contact with you. So when you're talking to them, they're looking at you. They're looking at your eyes. Now, they might also be looking at your mouth, right? Because they're looking at how you're forming words, but they're looking generally at your face and especially at your eyes, because that's how we communicate, right? We communicate by looking each other eye to eye, and children develop that skill very quickly. So if your child is not looking in your eyes, that is something to be concerned about. If your child is not babbling or making sounds by 12 months, that's also a concern. I remember in the milestones, I said they'll have a few words by 12 months. But when you should really be concerned is if they have no words. And what I mean words is not babbling. It's an actual word to obtain an item or a word to communicate something by 18 months. So if they've reached 18 months and have not spoken any words to communicate their wants or needs, then that's an area of concern. If they have some words, but they only have a few words, so remember that milestone for 2 years old was 50 plus words. If they only have maybe 5 words by age 2, like just a few words, a handful of words, then that is also another area of concern, right? So they should have more words than that by age 2. If you have difficulty with them understanding what you're saying. So you're speaking to them, but they don't understand and they don't follow through. So if you're like, come here and put your shoes on, and they never comply with that because they just don't understand what you're saying, that might be also a red flag for you, right? So if you had to go pick them up and bring them over to put their shoes on, rather than them just coming on their own. That might be them an understanding issue, right? So that would be the receptive language that might be a concern. And that's definitely something that you need to look into. Another thing that you might hear now, when children get a little bit older and they start saying words, like maybe around 2 or 3, you might hear repetition. Now, children love to repeat themselves. So I'm not talking about general repetition. I'm talking about repetition for certain words or phrases, things that they might say over and over again, but that don't have meaning. And I don't mean just being silly. I mean, if I say to them, put your shoes on, and they repeat back to me, put your shoes on. And they repeat it exactly the way I said it, right? So like copycat language, right? Where they only repeat what I say back to them. Did you put your shoes on? And they say, did you put your shoes on, right? That is repetitive words and phrase where they're copycatting. Maybe there is a concern there because they are not really understanding or responding in that communication exchange, right? They're just repeating what I'm saying. So they're hearing it and they're repeating it, but they're not understanding that they need to respond to my question. And that could also be a different kind of concern. So if you hear any kind of repetitive phrases or words or copycat kind of language, then that can also be an area of concern. So when should you seek support? So seek support basically when you notice any of those red flags, when those milestones I mentioned are significantly delayed. So if your child is not babbling by 12 months, that's definitely some time when you need to seek some professional support, right? Or any of those milestones, if they're significantly delayed. And when I say significantly delayed, I mean like by 6 months. So if the milestone that we talked about at 1 hasn't been achieved by 18 months, then you should go seek professional help. If the milestone at 2 years old hasn't been achieved by 2.5, then that's an opportunity then to go seek professional help. And there's a stigma around this. I need to say that people, it's unfortunate for children that their parents are not willing to seek support for them because there's a stigma associated with seeking support. And because of that, the child often suffers because they don't get the support they need in the early years when it would matter the most. And I see it happen all the time. So I really want to encourage you that if you see any kind of concern, it never hurts to get support. The worst that could happen is that it could say, you know what, you don't need this support. Great. At least you did your due diligence, you alleviated your concern. So never be afraid to seek support. If you see skills regressing, so they used to have words and now they no longer have those words, or they used to speak in 3 words, now they're speaking in 1 word. So you're seeing skills regress, that is an opportunity to seek professional guidance. If their speech is very unclear, nobody can understand them except for maybe you, that might be a time to seek professional guidance as well. If their frustration increases, if you start to see behavior issues because they can't communicate what they want or need, and they have a lot of frustration, that's also an opportunity to seek guidance. Or if you just feel concerned, that's the end of the line. Trust your instincts. So many times, educators and parents, we have instincts. We kind of just know that something doesn't feel right. And when that happens, go and seek support because you're usually right. You're usually right that you need some kind of support. And the earlier you get it, the better for your child. So now let's talk about, while you're waiting for that support, sometimes there's waiting lists. While you're waiting, or even if you don't need support and you just want to learn, what can I do to help my child develop speech and language? Here are some strategies. I'm going to go through a few things. The first thing is to talk. The way that children learn language is to hear the language spoken. So narrate your day. If you're at home or if you're in the classroom, you're going to narrate what's happening. You're going to talk, 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 talk. You're going to hate to hear your own voice because the more you talk, the more your child hears, the more their vocabulary develops. So a lot of times with children who are home, let's say with one parent most of the day, and they don't hear a lot of speech, right? Because maybe that parent is quiet. Maybe that parent is not talking that much, right? Maybe that parent, because maybe it's a baby and they don't feel the need to talk to the baby all day long. Maybe they're just quiet. Well, that child is not hearing a lot of language. Therefore, they can't develop a lot of language if they can't hear it, right? So if you are at home with a child on your own, you need to talk a lot. You need to narrate whatever you're doing. So if you're preparing lunch or dinner or breakfast, you're saying what you're doing. I'm cutting the apple. You're going outside. You're putting on your shoes. Here's your bottle. Do you want some milk? Always, always talking. And speaking in a very simple language, right? Not long sentences like you would talk to an adult, but more like, I'm cutting the apple. You're putting on shoes. You could see that those wouldn't be the way that I would talk to an adult. It's the way I'm talking to a child. I simplify my language a little bit to just focus on the key words that the child needs to understand. This works because it builds vocabulary naturally. Like I said, children learn language by hearing language. So if a child is in a quiet environment and never hears language, they're going to have difficulty developing it. Number two, read together. I can't express how important books are. My recommendation is one book a day, a book a day, every day. Choose things like repetitive books. Choose books that your child will love, common themes they'll love, things, especially in the early years, they love to hear stories about animals, about themselves, even. So you can make books, right? You know, if you're an educator in a classroom, you can make books about your students. They love those kind of books. But any kind of books that are repetitive, use rhyming, that are interactive, those are the best kind of books you want to read together. Sing songs. Singing songs are a great way to build language. So playing songs on your iPad or phone and singing along with them. Wheels on the Bus, Old MacDonald, if you know any finger plays, those are great ways to build language skills because children build that memory sound awareness. Sometimes children can sing the whole song from memory, right? Because sound and memory goes together. That's why, you can quickly memorize the words to a song because the memory sound connection is there, right? Even, more so than you can memorize a paragraph that I read out to you. You can easily hear and memorize words when they are accompanied by song. And you build vocabulary with song as well, right? We learn new words. We learn the word sheep through the Old MacDonald song, and we see the picture of the sheep. So we understand that's the word for sheep. So talking, reading, singing, these are basic things that everybody can do to build speech and language skills with young children. Next, you just want to play. I can't stress enough the importance of play. And when you're playing with the child, you need to follow their lead. You see this parent here with the child, they're right at the child's level, face to face. They're on the ground, they're playing with toys together. They're looking at what the child is interested in and playing with those things, whether it's cars or dolls or Lego, animals, blocks, whatever it is the child's interested in, you're also interested in and playing alongside them. When you join their play and narrate the play, right? Talk to them about what you're doing. I put my red block on top of your red block. My blue car goes zoom, right? When you're talking to them and playing with them, they're building vocabulary. People often wonder how we build vocabulary so easily in daycare. And it's because we talk so much. We talk about what we're doing when we're playing with the kids. We're constantly narrating our day. Many teachers in the classroom are talking. Many children in the classroom are talking. So think about all the language that the children are hearing. I once had a parent come to me and said, my pediatrician recommended that my child attend daycare to build language skills. And I was like, yes, that is a prescription for building language skills is to attend a childcare center, to be in a group environment where there's so much language happening. That is definitely a way to build language. Expand on their words, right? So when the child starts to say their first words, like let's say dog, when they're talking maybe about the family dog, you say, yes, big brown dog, right? So what you're doing is adding descriptive words to the word that they already know. So I'm saying big brown dog. So now they're starting to associate the color brown with the color of the animal they're looking at, the size of the animal. It's very big, right? So I expand on the words that they say by describing what they're saying, right? And that's how I can expand their vocabulary. Number 6 is reduce the pressure. So I know that even though you might have concerns, sometimes those concerns can result in pressure, right? We're pressuring children to talk before they're ready. So instead of saying, use your words, or say this, or say thank you, or say please, or say bottle, or whatever, instead of saying say it, you want to model it. So when I give the bottle to the child, I will say, here is your bottle. And then I might repeat that word, bottle. Or I might say, here is your apple, apple. Do you want a banana? So I am modeling the language rather than saying, say banana. If I say to the child, say banana, that puts pressure on them, right? And that creates anxiety. And when we put them in anxiety, they're not learning. So take away the anxiety, take away the pressure, and just model it for them. Just say, banana. And then they might repeat it, or they might just learn it, right? By you saying it continuously. So just model language instead of pressuring children to speak. So I know that you probably have a lot more questions because this is a topic that's huge, and I can't possibly, in a 30-minute webinar, cover the whole gamut of speech and language. And I just want to also say that I am not a speech and language specialist. I'm an educator, and I'm speaking to you from my own expertise and not from the field of speech and language pathology or anything like that. So these are just my recommendations to you to get more support. I recommend, first of all, if you have any concerns at all about language, go and see your pediatrician. That's your first step, and they can refer you to other specialists. The other thing you can do is there's often free speech and language workshops in your community where they do free assessments for children. The other thing you can do is look for checklists and milestones online, right? There's something called Look See. So just do a Google search on Look See checklist, and you will see a checklist of all developmental milestones. So you can see all development and if they're meeting their milestones. There's also the ASHA, which is the Speech Association of America. You can look at milestone charts on their websites. The CDC also has milestone charts for development and for speech in particular. So look up any kind of milestone, even if you just do a Google search on milestone checklists or speech milestone checklists, you'll find many websites that will give you a step-by-step breakdown of what you should expect at very specific ages. They'll go from 3 months to 6 months to 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, and so on. So you can get even more specific milestone charts than what I've presented today. If you are interested in building more early literacy skills for your child, I also offer a mini course. It's offered right now for $7 on my website. Check it out at www.susiebegin.com, or you can send me an email. I'll post my email on the next page, and I will send you the link to that course. It's a beautiful 1-hour course where you can learn how to teach your child early literacy skills. And it's expand a lot on what I've talked about today. And if you're interested, I also have a program called the Raising Bright Early Learners System. It's $29 for your first month. And you can ask me more about that. But basically, it's a complete play-based learning program that you can use at home with your child, or you can use to develop your skills as an educator. And you can reach out to me for that. So thank you so much for being here today. As I mentioned, you can reach out to me to get any of those supports if you want some of those checklists, or if you're interested in any of my courses, you can reach out to me at academy@susiebeguin.com. I'd be happy to send you the links to any of those. I wish you much success with your child on your journey, and I want to wish you a wonderful day. Thanks for joining me here today.